What if the most romantic tragedy to ever come out of the Forbidden City never actually happened? Butterflies, legend says, trailed her through the palace gardens, drawn by a perfume no court chemist could ever identify. Poets wrote about her. Filmmakers built entire careers on her story. Pilgrims still cross half of China to weep at a desert tomb in Kashgar, mourning a woman who, as we're about to find out, was never buried there at all. Here's the story you probably already know. A Muslim princess from China's western deserts gets captured after her people rise up against the empire. Soldiers march her 1,000 miles to Beijing and hand her over to the most powerful man alive. He falls for her instantly. He builds her a private mosque. He lets her keep her faith, her clothes, her language. In return, she gives him nothing but silence and a dagger hidden in her sleeve, sworn to kill them both the moment he touches her. When the emperor's own mother finally orders her to submit or die, she chooses death. Beautiful story. Almost entirely fiction. Search the Qing Dynasty's imperial archives. Arguably the most obsessively detailed government records in human history. And a woman matching that description simply isn't in them. No trial. No execution order. No scandal. Nothing. Either the greatest romantic tragedy in Chinese imperial history left zero paperwork, or somebody invented her. Historians didn't have to dig far to find the truth. Emperor Qianlong ruled for 60 years and kept more than 40 consorts, and exactly one of them came from the empire's far western frontier. Records name her Consort Rong. Her father's name matches the legend. Her brother's name matches the legend. Every detail points to the same real woman. She's just nothing like the myth built around her. To understand who she actually was, you have to forget Beijing for a minute and go west, to a scattered chain of Silk Road oasis towns known as the Tarim Basin. Merchants, empires, and religions had been colliding there for centuries. By the 1700s, the region's most powerful family was the Qujus, descendants of a revered Islamic holy man, part royalty, part clergy, and split down the middle by a generations-long feud between two rival branches. Picture caravans loaded with jade, silk, and spice threading between walled desert cities, each one ruled locally but tied loosely to whichever empire currently held the most leverage. Persian, Turkic, and Chinese influences all overlapped here, which explains why a single family could hold both political and religious authority at once, and why controlling that family mattered so much to an emperor sitting 2,000 miles away in Beijing. Two brothers led the rival faction that eventually revolted, and their goal wasn't independence from every outside power. It was replacing their own cousins as the region's rulers. Qianlong's court framed the resulting war as a rebellion against China because, strategically, that framing justified sending in troops. The messier truth, buried deeper in the archives, reads more like an empire stepping into somebody else's family feud and quietly backing the winning side. Born in 1734 into the powerful White Mountain branch of that family, the woman who'd become Consort Rong grew up in the middle of exactly that conflict. Qing court scribes labeled her people Hoi, a catch-all term for Muslims from the region. Pay close attention here, because this is precisely where the fan fiction version of her life falls apart. According to the legend, she was dragged to Beijing as punishment after a rebellion. The actual archives say the opposite happened. Qianlong needed this frontier too badly to risk losing it. It guarded his empire's border and controlled a fortune in Silk Road trade. So when an uprising broke out in 1757, he crushed it fast. But that uprising wasn't the West revolting against China. It was a civil war inside the Koja family itself, two brothers trying to seize power for themselves. Rong's own relatives didn't join the rebels. They fought against them. Her brother, Tudor, rode with imperial troops to help put the rebellion down. Once the fighting ended in 1759, and the rebel leaders were executed, Beijing didn't drag Tudor's family through the streets in chains. It welcomed them as honored allies, showering them with titles and wealth. That single fact demolishes the legend's entire foundation. This was never a kidnapped rebel princess. age 26, in the year 1760. She walked into the Forbidden City as a living peace treaty, proof that the western frontier now stood beside the Qing, not against it. Call that a political arrangement if you want. There's truth in that, but it still doesn't explain the next 28 years of her life, because a woman brought in purely as a political trophy doesn't usually end up this beloved. Newcomers to the imperial harem normally started at the very bottom, learning etiquette under a senior consort for years before climbing the ranks. Rong skipped nearly all of it. The palace placed her directly inside the empress's own household and, once her brief training ended, handed her the title, Noble Lady. Harmony? Skipping ranks most women waited a decade to reach. Then, something almost comically convenient happened. Lychee trees in Beijing that hadn't fruited in years suddenly produced a massive harvest right after she arrived. Modern readers call that a coincidence. An 18th century imperial court called it heaven's approval. And even the emperor's own mother started treating the newcomer as a bringer of good fortune, a reputation that would quietly shield her for the rest of her life. None of that matches the suffering captive version of events. But don't mistake privilege for an easy ride, either. She'd landed in one of the most cutthroat courts on earth, speaking a different language, praying to a different god, eating food nobody around her recognized. By every measure, she was the outsider in the room. Rather than pressure her to blend in, the emperor did something almost unheard of. He protected her differences on purpose. Palace kitchens prepared halal meals exclusively for her. Attendants from her own homeland served her personally. Separate dishes appeared at imperial banquets, so she'd never have to break her faith to eat with the court. He even had Quranic verses carved into a garden pavilion at the old summer palace. Sit with that for a second. The ruler of a massive Manchu empire wasn't asking a Muslim woman to abandon her religion. He was making absolutely sure she never had to. And that generosity wasn't just personal affection, it was calculated diplomacy. Every privilege handed to her broadcast a message straight back to the newly conquered frontier. Loyalty gets rewarded here, not erased. By 1762, she'd been renamed Rong, a character that can mean beauty, but also carries the sense of tolerance or inclusion. Fitting, since she'd stopped being just one man's favorite and had become a walking symbol of the empire's relationship with an entire region. 6 years later, in 1768, she held the rank of full consort, one of the highest-ranking women in the palace. Seated near the emperor at banquets and traveling alongside the royal family on state trips. None of that is the life of a prisoner. It's the life of someone the emperor wanted the whole court to see. Which raises an obvious question. If she was this honored, where on earth did the tragic legend come from? To answer that, we need to talk about the one part of her real story that, by every rule of the Qing court, should have destroyed her completely. 28 years in the palace, and Consort Rong never had a single child. In the Forbidden City, that alone usually ended a woman's career. Status ran on producing an heir, and childless consorts typically faded into irrelevance. So why didn't she? Part of it comes down to plain circumstance. Entering the palace at 26 already counted as unusually old for marriage in that era, and not long after arriving, her health began deteriorating. Palace medical records describe years of chronic illness, and most historians point to the brutal shift from her homeland's dry desert climate to Beijing's harsher one as the likely culprit. Strangely enough, the very thing that should have ruined her became her armor. Every other consort was locked in a brutal, invisible war over whose son would eventually sit on the throne. Alliances, betrayals, poisonings, by rumor, the works. Rong never entered that battlefield at all. Unable to produce a rival heir, she threatened absolutely nobody, and her empty cradle made her politically untouchable. Politics explains the rest of it. Hurting or humiliating her would have insulted an entire allied family that had chosen loyalty over rebellion. So while other women fought tooth and nail just to survive inside those palace walls, Rong stood above the entire fight, not because she won it, but because she'd never been forced to play. She remained one of Qianlong's most respected companions until 1788, when she died at 53 after years of failing health. Surviving palace memorials describe the emperor ordering her belongings, robes, jewelry, personal treasures, distributed throughout the palace, so pieces of her would stay among the people she'd lived beside for nearly 3 decades. Then he buried her with full imperial honors. Remember that desert tomb in Kashgar, the one thousands of tourists still visit every year to mourn the tragic, fragrant consort. Here's where the whole story falls apart for good. If Rong genuinely lived a long, respected, drama-free life, the tragic legend had to come from somewhere else entirely, and checking the timeline exposes exactly where. A scandal this dramatic, a dagger pulled on the emperor, a secret execution ordered by his own mother, would never have stayed buried for a century straight. Officials documented far smaller court gossip obsessively. Yet after Rong's death in 1788, an entire century passes in total silence before anyone tells this version of her story at all. Tracking the myth's actual birth is oddly satisfying. Its earliest known mention, from 1892, is almost boring. Just a woman from Kashgar who supposedly smelled pleasant. No dagger. No execution. Just a scent. By 1904, storytellers had added the emperor's mother secretly killing her, and each retelling afterward piled on another dramatic twist. Everything exploded once the Qing Dynasty actually collapsed. In 1914, palace treasures went on public display for the first time, including a portrait of an unidentified court woman. Curators, guessing, slapped the fragrant consort label on her and hung the painting inside a hall called Yudtang, the Hall of Bathing Virtue. That single naming decision did the rest of the damage. Imaginations ran wild from there. A mysterious foreign beauty, displayed in a room with bathing, literally in its name, somehow became a woman with her own luxury bathhouse and secret beauty rituals. None of that traces back to any historical record. Just a label, and the room it happened to hang in. Other unidentified portraits got the same treatment over the decades, including one showing the woman in European-style armor, which historians agree a Qing consort would never have actually worn. By the time facts stopped mattering, the legend had already won, and maybe that's exactly why it survived so long. Because it was never really one fixed story. Depending on who's telling it, she's a romantic heroine seduced by imperial power, or a defiant symbol of resistance who never abandoned her faith. Same historical woman, 2 wildly different meanings layered on top of her. Which brings us back to that fragrance nobody's ever actually explained. Official records never mention any unusual scent, so historians can only guess. Sachets, unfamiliar foods, perfumes carried from her homeland. The simplest explanation is probably the correct one. She dressed differently, ate differently, worshipped differently, and carried the ordinary, familiar smell of home into a place where everything about her already seemed exotic. We started this story in Kashgar, at a tomb thousands still visit to mourn her, a tomb that isn't hers. Her actual remains rest in the eastern Qing tombs outside Beijing, while the Kashgar site belongs to her extended family's dynasty, not to her personally. Archaeologists finally opened her real burial in 1979 during restoration work, and that's where the legend met the evidence head-on. Quranic verses in Arabic still marked her coffin, a final quiet confirmation that her faith had been honored even in death. Inside lay the remains of an older woman with gray hair and an unusually tall frame for her era. Not a young princess who died defending her honor, not a martyr, just someone who had genuinely lived a long life. No dagger. No secret execution. The legend didn't just get a few details wrong, it got the entire ending backwards. Maybe that's the strangest part of this whole story. For over 100 years, a woman who never existed became far more famous than the one who actually did. One version got remembered as a tragic captive. The real Consort Rong was a respected diplomat, a devout Muslim who never hid her faith, and one of the most honored women to ever live inside the Forbidden City. Proof that quiet, peaceful success rarely gets remembered the way tragedy does. If stories like this, the parts of history the costume dramas leave out, are exactly your thing, subscribe, because we've barely scratched the surface.